Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and the title of today's presentation is Rescued by Extraterrestrials. I've done a lot of research into UFO healing cases. That's not what I'm going to be talking about today. These are about cases in which ETs have directly intervened in people's lives to help them, save them, or rescue them from some type of situation. There's quite a few different cases. I've got about 20 here in which people have been rescued from various things such as car accidents, being stranded, drowning, assault, poverty, natural disasters. So yeah, this I think shows a much more benevolent and altruistic side to the ETs that we don't hear a lot about. We hear a lot of fear-based cases. But the truth is, there are a lot of cases in which ETs have helped people in really dramatic ways. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. And some of these cases are just truly amazing. First case I want to talk about comes from one of my favorite researchers, Artie Six Killer Clark. She reported about this case in her book, Sky People. It's an amazing case. This occurred off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula in a small Mayan village outside of Tulum. This occurred in 2004 when this little Mayan village was being battered by a very strong hurricane force winds and rain. And everyone was freaking out. They were getting ready to evacuate. One of the residents, his name was Geraldo, he and his family were getting what they could together and getting ready to evacuate when suddenly all the wind just stopped. All the rain stopped. At the same time, there was this very, very bright light over the entire village. And I'll just let Geraldo describe what he saw in his own words. Says Geraldo, "Overhead, just at treetop level, there was a UFO. It was round, and it lit up the whole village. The rain stopped. The wind stopped. The UFO was like an umbrella. It was protecting us. For several hours, the UFO stayed over our village. When the wind and rains lessened, it moved on." An amazing case. Geraldo says that everyone in the village saw the craft, and a few actually reported being taken on board. After this whole event, he approached the village elders and asked them about the event, and they had a response, and this is what Geraldo says. They said the sky gods came back to protect us. They said our village survived because it was a reminder of the injustice visited upon the Mayan people by the Mexican government. So that's one case in which UFOs show a real benevolence toward humans, and there are many others. Here's another case which comes from MUFON. This occurred in 1977, 1978 in Forest Hills, Texas. This comes from an anonymous witness who finally reported their case to the Mutual UFO Network, and I'll just let him describe what happened in his own words. "I was about 21 years old and had BS'd my way into a job in which I had no skills. One skill I needed was typing, so I had immediately enrolled in a night typing course, which was in Fort Worth, Texas. I was traveling home on I-20 East. There was not much traffic that time of night. In fact, I do not remember any traffic at all, which now seems rather strange to me. All of a sudden, there was a huge light, the brightest light I have ever seen before or since. I slowed down to see what it was, but could only see the light. I then realized what the light was showing me. There was a mattress in the lane ahead of me that I would never have seen, which would have caused me to have an accident. I pulled to the side of the road, forgetting about the mattress, and rolled down the window. My first thought was that it was a helicopter, but there was absolutely no sound. When I say no sound, I mean no sound, as in any normal night sounds, or traffic, much less a helicopter sound. I wasn't scared. As a matter of fact, I felt a feeling of peace like I have never felt. All of a sudden, the light was gone. The witness drove home and shortly later called Carswell Air Force Base, which was nearby, and asked them about it, and they had no information at all about the experience. And finally, after sometime later, after seeing a television show on UFOs, he reported his case to MUFON. And as he says, what I experienced back then was the most awesome and peaceful event that anyone could experience. I do not know what it was, but I do know that it was real, very real. Whatever or whoever it was saved me from what could have been a horrible accident. It could not have been something from this earth. One of the most common types of ET intervention is people being rescued from car accidents. Here's another case in which someone was rescued from a car accident. This was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center, New Fork, but also appeared in Tom Dongo's book, Alien Tide. This case occurred outside of Cave Junction in Oregon around 1980 when a lady was driving on this old logging road outside of the town of Cave Junction. And I'll just let her describe what happened in her own words. It's an amazing case. This is her talking. I somehow got off on a logging road which was winding along a steep mountain. After a while, I noticed that the road was narrowing, and I was afraid to follow it any further. I decided to try and turn my car around and drive back to Cave Junction, which was about 30 minutes away. As I was backing up the car, it went off of the road. The rear end was off of the road and the car was tottering. I slowly got out and was trying to figure out how to get my dogs out, which were in the kennel in the back of the car. If I tried to reach them, the car could tumble down the cliff. While I was trying to decide what to do, a big car pulled up and 4 tall Oriental men with a strange skin tone, too orange, got out of the car. In spite of the 100+ degree heat of the day, they were all wearing black trench coats. I said, "Hello." They did not reply. Without a word, they went to the front of my car and picked it up and sat it back on the road, facing the direction back to home. I do not think that even twice that number of humans could have lifted my car from the front end only and placed it back on the road. I do not remember how I got past their car, or they passed mine, as they were headed up the Firebreak Road, as I was originally as well. The afterthought of the encounter left me really scared, and as soon as I was back in town, I rented a hotel room and slept for a couple of days. Those weird men on the mountain saved our lives, but they still scared me. Very strange case involving benevolent men in black who appear out of nowhere and disappear out of nowhere. Car accidents do seem to be the most common type of rescue. And here's another case, which is just really interesting. This case comes from a lady by the name of Lillian Richter. She's written about her experiences in an excellent book called Visitors Behind Our Stars. This case occurred around 2001 when Lillian had gone to visit her mother, who lived in the deserts of Southern California. And it was quite a drive out there. And after visiting her mother all day, Lillian decided it was time to leave. At this point, it was 4 p.m., and she wanted to get home before it got too late. So she had to leave at 4, and she got on the road and had only been driving a few minutes. This is a very isolated area. She's driving along the highway and is about 20 minutes away from the freeway. And then this strange thing happened. As she said, suddenly her red warning lights started to blink on and off. She's traveling at about 70 miles per hour at this point, and she starts to slow down to stop when suddenly something takes over her car and it starts accelerating by itself. First going up to 70 again, then up to 80 and 90 and approaching 100 miles per hour. She's trying to stop, but the car won't stop. The hood is banging. As Lillian says, and I'm quoting here, I continued to apply pressure on the brakes, but instead the car started to accelerate again. Now I was moving at a speed of 100 miles per hour, but now I was starting to panic. It was like someone else had control of my vehicle. So she's totally freaking out, and this goes on for just a few minutes when suddenly the car slows down and she's able to stop. And she pulls over to the road and is sitting there trying to gather her wits when she decides she's going to continue the drive back home and tries to start the car, but it will not start. It's totally dead. So she's like, okay, my car's broken down, and she gets her cell phone to call someone for help, and her cell phone is dead. And so now she doesn't know what to do, and this is when a huge black craft appears right over her car. It flashes this super bright, brilliant white light, so bright she can't even see for a second. And as soon as her vision restores to normal, this craft is gone. And so she's freaking out again when suddenly, she tries to start her car again. It still won't start. And she's not sure what to do when this craft appears again. It's very low. It's about 10 feet off the ground and maybe 300 feet away. It's very large. It's shaped like a manta ray, totally black. It's got a couple of lights on it, a red and a white light on the underside, and it's got a greenish glow about it, especially towards the back of it. And she can see what appears to be a porthole, perhaps. And so she's kind of freaking out. She's shouting at the craft, blaming it for her stopping her on this highway. And she grabs her camera. This is a brand new camera she had just bought. She remembered she had it, and this craft was right there. And she grabs it and points it at this thing. And at this point, the camera completely fails and does not work. And she keeps trying to start the car. And this is when she hears a voice. And it said, in perfect English, a male voice, "Do not start your car." She looked around her thinking someone was next to her, but there was no one around. And she decided she's going to get out of the car and search and get a better look at what's going on. And as soon as she does, she hears this voice again. It says, "Do not try to get out of your car." And she said it was as if someone was in the car with her. And she shouted out, "I have to go home. I'm afraid to stay here. I need to get back on the highway before it's dark." And there was no response, and she had no choice really but to just sit there and stare at this craft. And after a few moments, it said, the same voice, "You can go now." And she was somewhat relieved, but still shaken up, and she tries to start the car, and of course it does work, and she drives off, and this object paces her car all the way to the freeway. And she gets a really good feeling from it. She's, for some reason, not afraid, and at some point it just darts off right before she gets to the freeway. And she gets on the freeway, and she notices it's extremely trafficy, lots of traffic, and suddenly all the traffic comes to a complete halt. And looking ahead of her, she can see that, in fact, there is a 5-car accident right in front of her. She had gotten there pretty much immediately after it happened, and she got this cold chill. And as she says, and I'll just quote her here directly, "I stood there stunned. All of a sudden it hit me that I would have been in this accident if I hadn't pulled over. I realized that it could not have been coincidental that the black craft held me back. This black craft had pulled me over for that reason and saved my life. It convinced me right then and there that that craft had done this remarkably kind act and saved my life." She asked other people who were there and learned that this accident had just happened, and looking at the vehicles that had been involved in this accident, she saw that they were SUVs, just like her own. Same model, same make. So that also kind of freaked her out. But it's another amazing case in which ETs have intervened to save someone from a car accident. Here's another amazing case, very much like this, but even perhaps more dramatic. This occurred in 1956. The main witness is Dave Shoup. He's actually a really amazing man. He's been having encounters his whole life, but as an adult became very well educated. He's now a college professor, has a PhD in agricultural engineering, has worked in various capacities, including developing MREs, meals ready to eat, for the military, and food sterilization techniques, and other applications of environmental science. So yeah, very highly educated and a great witness. Back in 1956, he was just a little boy, had already had a number of UFO experiences when he had another really dramatic case involving a rescue. At the time, he was outside of the hospital, the St. Elizabeth Hospital in Lafayette, Indiana. His mother had recently contracted polio and was having regular treatments there. And since he was there a lot, Dave would often go out into the park next to the hospital and play games with some of the other children who also had parents in the hospital. There was another little girl a year older than him, Mary Ann, who he would often play with. And one day he was out there in the park and they were just kicking this can around when one of them kicked the can and it went out into the street. And she chased after it. And right when she jumped into the street, a car had come screeching around the corner and was heading right towards her. It was literally inches from her, and it was very clear to everyone who was there that she was about to be struck by this fast-moving vehicle. And I'll just let Dave describe what happened next. This is Dave talking. Then, just as the car was a fraction of an inch from her, everything stopped. I could see the driver's face clearly. His face was frozen in a position of shock. The passenger was an older lady whose eyes were frozen wide and her mouth wide open. There was no sound, no movement. I looked around me and saw that nothing was moving. No birds creaked, no dog moved. People in the park looked like statues. I looked above me and saw the familiar, shiny, flying saucer suspended above the scene. It was soundless and only wobbled slightly. Nothing was moving. I moved forward to catch Mary Ann, but she fell to the ground, so I dragged her to the curb. At that moment, everything started moving. Sound resumed, and the UFO was gone. Time, as far as I could tell, had stopped, just long enough for me to enter the scene and prevent the car from hitting Mary Ann and probably killing her. I sat on the side of the curb, and my body shook uncontrollably. People who were driving the car at this point got out and were completely freaking out. They said that they thought for sure they had hit the girl, but they hadn't. She did break her arm from being pulled onto the sidewalk, but everyone who was there saw that somehow Dave had miraculously saved her life, and he was hailed as a hero and received a lot of accolades for this. It's a very interesting case. We're seeing a lot of very interesting aspects in some of these cases. In this case, we see that time stopped. I've seen that in other cases. And in the other case where the person was rescued from a mattress on the road, we saw that there was no traffic on the road. We've seen that before, where traffic disappears in places where there should be traffic. Or perhaps the case involving the men in black, in which they lifted a car up and moved it on the road. This involves obviously what seems to be superhuman strength. So definitely some very weird aspects to these cases. And one of my favorite cases, I'm often asked, what's the strangest case you've ever personally investigated? And sometimes this case does come to mind. It's a very strange case. The lady wants a pseudonym to be used, so I call her Sherry. And I know her really well. She was a part of actually the CSETI group that we formed here in Los Angeles, and we go out and see UFOs regularly. So she was part of that group, and really amazing lady. She was a real estate agent for many years and very successful at it, and changed careers and became a therapist. So really a good witness, and has had UFO experiences her entire life. As a little girl, she would sometimes wake up in her room and her pajamas would be put on wrong, and she'd find sticks and twigs and leaves in her bed, and her parents would get really upset at her. And she says, it's not my fault. She remembered once suddenly finding herself outside, and she's running in terror from this UFO and comes up against a barbed wire fence, and this beam of light comes out of the UFO and hits her. Suddenly she's very calm as she's being pulled up into the craft. That's all she really remembers. So she's had a number of missing time incidents, but this one strange incident that I'd like to talk about occurred in the early 1960s in the Watchung Mountains of New Jersey. I actually covered this incident in my book, Extraterrestrial Visitations, and it's just an amazing case. Sherry was driving a motorcycle through the Watchung Mountains late at night. This is an old style motorcycle which didn't have an electric ignition. It had an old kickstarter. These motorcycles, to start them, you had to kickstart them with a sort of a little kickstand type thing. And she's driving through the mountains when she had an accident. For some reason, she just slipped, and the motorcycle slipped out from under her and slid across the road, and thankfully she was fine. She was not injured, but the motorcycle was. In fact, the Kickstarter had been completely bent out of shape to a point where she couldn't start her bike. So she was stranded at this point. She's stranded in the middle of the mountains late at night. This is a very rural area. She's not expecting to see any cars driving by, so she's not sure what she's going to do. And this is when it became very strange. These two beings, figures, appeared right next to her. And she says it was pretty frightening. These looked like not quite grays, but kind of grays. They were about 5 feet tall. They were bald, had very large dark eyes, very pale skin, but looked almost human and probably could have passed for human, she said, if they had been wearing sunglasses and hat, perhaps. But she says they were wearing these sort of tan jumpsuits, and they didn't say a word. They just looked at her. One took the motorcycle and stood it up, while the other bent down next to the motorcycle and began straightening the Kickstarter with its hands and actually appeared to fix it. And I'll just quote Sherry here briefly. There were two of them. They looked at me and silently picked up the motorcycle, took the kick bar and straightened it. I nodded and kicked it, and off I went. So yeah, they were able to fix this motorcycle just without any instruments. It appeared that they just used their hands. And the whole incident occurred very quickly, maybe a minute. And she never saw any UFO. She just got on that motorcycle, started it up, and drove off. She didn't look back. At the time, it did kind of freak her out, and she regrets not staying and at least observing a little more closely. As she says, I wish now I could not have been so worried or disturbed, that I could have paid more attention. But they weren't threatening. It was just very strange. So yeah, I mean, not sure what to make of these cases other than that these ETs are intervening for altruistic reasons. And there's a lot of these types of cases. I think most people probably don't report them because they're so strange. Here's a case which was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center. This occurred in the fall of 1959 to four friends, four young teenagers actually, who had driven away from Hollywood and in California and were just driving through Nevada on sort of a joyride, just a way to get out of LA. And they found themselves outside this very small town in Nevada. It's called Goldfield, Nevada. And they were just driving through the desert and on these desert roads when they became trapped in the sand. And they tried to dig themselves out and couldn't, and just got themselves dug deeper and deeper in until pretty much the truck was half buried, the wheels, in the sand. And so they decided they're just going to have to spend the night, and one of them will walk out in the morning. And they all get in the sort of car and laying out in the bed of the truck there. It's a pickup truck. And talking about things, and they started talking about UFOs. At some point, the subject came up, and one of the guys, I call him Bradley, that's a pseudonym. Bradley's girlfriend says, just joking, let's see if we can contact a saucer to help us. And so they all started just telepathically calling out to UFOs, and as Bradley says, started trying to telepathically contact a saucer. And I'll just let the witness, Bradley, say what happened next. Here's him talking. Not long afterward, we all saw a light approaching. I don't know the direction it came from. It looked just like a bright star, except it was moving toward us. It got much brighter as it drew overhead. At that moment, we felt the truck move. It rose straight up in the air about a foot or two off the ground, floated to the middle of the road, and gently set down. Then the light moved back in the direction it came from and blinked out. Bradley remembers the time that they all screamed in fear and immediately drove off. Some years later, he contacted his girlfriend, and she immediately remembered the incident pretty much exactly the same as he did, except she remembered they were all laughing, where he remembered they were all kind of screaming in fear. And I know how unusual this case sounds, but I have to tell you, there are dozens of cases in which cars have been lifted up. We call these car lift cases, and sometimes it's just a few feet, sometimes it's all the way up into a UFO, sometimes it's just two wheels. So this case is not as unusual as you might think. And yes, there are cases in which people have telepathically called out for UFOs and they have arrived. So it does fit the pattern of other cases, and it's just this really amazing, benevolent case. Perhaps the ultimate case of this kind, and certainly one of my favorite, involves a group of people who are lost at sea or stuck in a very bad storm. And this is truly an amazing case. This occurred in June of 1994, and every year there's sort of this annual regatta in which a bunch of amateur boaters and professional boaters do this sort of regatta in their boats, traveling from New Zealand to Tonga, to the island of Tonga. And a bunch of people were participating on this day, and weather conditions had seemed to be fine when out of nowhere a very strong storm developed and just kept getting worse and worse. And suddenly it became a force 12 storm, which is very bad. These involve waves of 100 feet, winds that are traveling at 100 knots, and there were dozens of boats who were caught in the path of this storm. And while some were able to make it to safety, a lot were not. They were caught dead center of this storm. And one by one, these boats became swamped, and their masts were breaking, and the sails were shredding, and their steering was becoming breaking, and some of these craft started to sink. And so all of them were turning on their emergency beacons all at once. And this caused all kinds of problems because the emergency beacons were becoming crossed, and the rescuers weren't able to locate a lot of these witnesses. So this whole story is told in the book Rescue in the Pacific by Tony Farrington. And that's where I originally got part of this story, though one of the witnesses did later write a book about it, and we'll get to that. But this amazing case that involves one particular boat, which is called the Ramtha, after the channeled entity by J.Z. Knight, Ramtha. And the owners of the boat are Bill and Robin Forbes. They own this boat called the Ramtha, and they got caught right in this storm. And it wasn't long before their sails got stripped and their steering mechanism broke, and they radioed in for help. And while they were in radio contact with the rescuers could not find them because there was so many of these emergency beacons going off all at once. And by this time it was night. And these 100-foot waves were battering all these boats. Some boats had sunk. People were losing their lives at this point. So this is a very scary time, very serious. And Bill and Robin Forbes, their boat is becoming swamped. And it's getting battered by these waves. And it's not going to be long. They're pretty sure that their boat is going to sink. And as they're clinging inside their small cabin, suddenly this bright light appears over their boat. And at first they thought it was a flare, but there was a very strange quality about it. And I'll just quote Tony Farrington, who wrote the account of this case here. As Farrington writes, "Something had changed. Something was different. At first Robin had trouble identifying it. Then she realized they were bathed in light. She moved out of the shelter and stared in awe at a green orb that hovered to port, illuminating the angry world about them. She couldn't believe her eyes. It was impossible to pinpoint the exact source of the light. It was unlike anything she'd experienced before, certainly completely different from the lightning that had shattered the darkness earlier in the evening." "Bill, come look at this," Robin said. "What the hell is it?" he asked. This light was 20 feet over the mast. It was very large and actually was changing in color. Initially it was green, but it changed to white, then to orange, and back to green, then to white, and to orange, and it was blinking in all these different colors. Clearly not ball lightning. Bill Forbes was a pilot, and as he says, "I've never seen anything like it. It's massive. Maybe it's a fireball. It's not lightning. It's just hovering." Meanwhile, the rescuers, who are on board a ship called the Mono Y, a very large ship, saw this light. And they're like, "What is that?" And they sent out a radio call to the survivors who they were in contact with and asked them if anyone had launched a flare. And no one had. And when Bill and Robin Forbes heard this message, they responded and said, "No, we haven't launched a flare, but we do have this weird light hovering over our boat. It's directly over our boat." And a short time later, the light blinks off. But at this point, the Mono Y has located the location. They've got the location of where this light was. So Bill and Robin Forbes, though they're not in the most distress, there are other boats that are in much more danger, are put first on the list because they're close by and they know exactly where they are. And as soon as dawn arrives, the Mono Y shows up and rescues Bill and Robin Forbes. Their boat by this point is completely swamped, and they are pulled right on board the Mono Y and are among the first saved. Meanwhile, there's other people in this storm who are still struggling to survive, and there's another really amazing case that involves extraterrestrials. There's another ship called the Heartlight. This is being piloted by the Wheeler family. Diviana Wheeler, the wife, is actually a UFO contactee, and she's traveling with her family on this regatta when this storm strikes. It's funny because earlier she had gotten a very strong premonition that they would be put in peril, to the edge of peril, is what the premonition told her. And they had just gone through a pretty severe storm, so they thought that was it. But as soon as this storm struck, they knew that they were wrong, and then, in fact, this storm was what the premonition was referring to. And this is a very severe storm, and Diviana started getting direct messages from her ET contacts, and they told her that, quote, "the kingdom of heaven is now at hand." And they activated their rescue beacon because their boat was getting severely swamped. It was being hit broadside by the waves over and over again. There had been several near capsizes, and Diviana started to get messages that the boat would in fact capsize, and she got a very strong premonition that the boat was in fact going to sink. She got a very clear vision of the boat sinking beneath the waves. So she didn't tell her family this. She told them exactly where to stand in case the boat should capsize or sink, which appeared imminently to do. And they did their best to steer this thing. But at some point the steering became jammed, and the boat was hit so hard by the waves, the hull actually cracked, and water started to pour in. And so this point, she knew that they didn't have much time. The storm was beginning to blow itself out at this point, but they were on the verge of sinking. And were very worried because so far no one had been able to find them. And it wasn't long, thankfully, after this that they were in fact found. And a fishing boat driving nearby came upon them and pulled them from the Heartlight and got them on board the fishing boat. And it was about 2 hours later, their boat sank to the bottom of this ocean, never seen from again, and they survived. They survived through the guidance and the premonitions given to Diviana by these ETs. She ended up writing a book about this. It's called Heartlight Rescue at Sea, and a truly amazing case. And there is sort of an interesting end note to all this regarding the other boat, the Ramtha, owned by Bill and Robin Forbes. Because they had lost their boat, they had sunk all their life savings into that boat and had pretty much lost everything. While they did have insurance, it was not going to cover nearly the costs of the boat and their belongings. So they were pretty upset, and it was about 2 days after this storm when the New Zealand Air Force got a call about a light that was hovering over this area where the storm had been. And it was another UFO, this giant unexplained ball of light. And it was hovered long enough that they decided to vector a plane out to this area, and they did. And the ball of light disappeared by the time they got there, but they did find a boat, and it turned out to be no other boat than the one owned by Bill and Robin Forbes, the Ramtha. So they got their boat back. And here we have a UFO apparently not only saving Bill and Robin Forbes, but saving them from financial ruin by showing them where their boat was. So they were able to recover their boat and their belongings, and it had a real happy ending. Tragically, some people did lose their lives in this incident, but it's an amazing case where UFOs rescue people who are lost at sea. And people are helped in various ways. I went to a convention, a UFO convention once in Northern California, and met this amazing guy by the name of Chuck Weiss, who had written a book called Abducted by Aliens. And he was a really nice man. We ended up trading books. It's a very interesting book. And what I found fascinating about it was he was healed several times. But he was not only healed, he was helped in the most unusual way. This is one of the most unusual cases I've heard, really, of how ETs have intervened to help people in their lives. He has a lot of what he calls these dreams, these alien dreams in which grays appear. And he had one of these dreams, as Chuck says. He was having one of these alien dreams, and in the dream, he had this weird thing happen. As he says, I was given a sheet of paper by my supervising gray and told to look at it very carefully. He did, and he saw all these columns of weird letters. As he says, it didn't make any sense to me. And that's where the dream ended. And at the time, Chuck was unemployed and it was getting pretty desperate. He needed a job. He was out of funds, and he was not having any luck with any of these jobs. And finally, his employment agency sent him to a company that specialized in copying and dubbing radio and television commercials. And Weiss was given the job of reviewing the work orders to making sure they were coded correctly. And I will just quote Chuck here, as he says, "After a round of introductions in my new office, I was shown the paperwork that I was expected to proofread. My jaw dropped to the floor when I saw a column of station call letters running down the left side of the paper. It was exactly what I had been shown months earlier by my supervising Gray. It was suddenly obvious to me that it had been determined long before I went to work there that I would find employment at that particular company and in that particular office of the company. I was blown away. Aside from a couple of spontaneous healings that I couldn't be sure weren't to just keep their rat running the maze, this was my first real indication that for whatever reason, I was somehow special to them. I had never heard before of the ETs going out of their way to find a job for an experiencer, nor have I since. After 5 months of working for the company as a temp, I was made a permanent hire with vacations and full benefits." So it appears as if the Grays were acting as an employment agency that had actually found him this job for him, or at least shown him that he would be getting this job, because what he saw in the dream was exactly what he saw in real life. And while Chuck says that's the only case of people being helped financially or to find a job, there are, in fact, some similar cases. And here's actually a very early case, which occurred in July of 1939 to a gold prospector by the name of João Lucindo. This case was first investigated by UFO researcher, Brazilian UFO researcher Jackson Luiz Camargo. And in this case, João Lucindo was out camping and gold prospecting in a remote area of Brazil called Serra de Gordo. And he was out there camping one night, heard this very loud whistling noise. At that moment, he sees two tall humanoids. They're wearing these silvery jumpsuits. They tell him, "Look up." He looks up and sees this enormous kind of saucer-shaped craft, a UFO. Next thing he knows, he finds himself on board along with these two humanoids. He's laid on a table. He's physically examined. Afterwards, he's told that this encounter would benefit his family in some way. And he wasn't sure how, but the next night he had a very strange dream in which these same humanoids appeared, and they showed him this map and this location. And they said, "This is where you should dig for gold. If you dig here for gold, you will find it." And that's what he did. He went to this exact area where they had pinpointed and found a vein of gold, which he told researcher Jackson Luiz Camargo that he was able to extract quite a bit of gold from it. So yeah, a really amazing case, and certainly, although strange, not unique. In fact, a lot of these cases do have similarities, or they're very similar in various ways. There's a couple of cases in which people were saved of drowning. And reptilians often get a bad rap, but in this case it was actually reptilians who did save this 20-year-old man by the name of Jose Alvarez from drowning. This case occurred in January of 1977. It comes from researchers Janet and Colin Board, and it occurred in the high basin area of Amazonia. This is sort of east of Lima, Peru, And the witness, Jose Alvarez, was hiking around in this very remote area and was looking for a spring or some place where he could get some drinking water. And walking along a path, slipped and fell into this swampy area and tried to get out, but found himself trapped in this kind of quicksand-like mud. And I'll just quote the witness directly here, as Jose Alvarez says, "In spite of my efforts, I could not get out of it, and I had lost all hopes to survive when suddenly 4 small beings appeared. They were less than 1 meter tall, the body covered with green scales, and their hands had 3 fingers with claws. Uttering growls and gesticulating, they held branches to me that allowed me to pull myself back on firm ground." It took all he had in him to get out of this swamp. He said he was absolutely exhausted, and as soon as he got pulled out, he passed out, just lost consciousness. And when he woke up, these beings were gone. These short, like 3-foot tall, green-scaled beings were gone. And wow, what a case. But actually not unique. Here is another case that's really almost identical. I got this case from Albert Rosali's book, The Humanoids Amongst Us. This occurred in Sidra to a very young boy. He lived on a 6-acre farm with his family, and he was around 6 years old and was just walking around out there in the wilds, picking flowers for his mother, when he slipped and fell up into this mud. And before he knew it, as he's struggling to get out, he was up to his neck in mud, and he was sure that he was not going to make it, and he was going to die. And he lost consciousness at this point. He's up to his neck in mud, unable to get out. He loses consciousness, and then suddenly he wakes up, and he's no longer in the mud. He's lying next to this mud puddle, and there's this figure wearing reflective clothing, a kind of a reflective jumpsuit, standing next to him, and looks at him just briefly and disappears in a flash of light. So he feels sure that he was rescued by this figure wearing this kind of silvery jumpsuit, and believes it was an ET because following this incident, he started being pulled from his room into a UFO on a bi-weekly basis, once or twice a week. And as a result, following this incident, his intelligence improved dramatically. He became very intelligent and was the star pupil in his school and graduated out of a class of 400 kids, head of the class. And he completely attributes this to the ETs. And it's actually not the only case I know of in which ETs have improved a person's intelligence. So they are intervening in a lot of ways. Here's another case which I personally investigated. This was reported in my book, Extraterrestrial Visitations, and it occurred to a woman by the name of Rose Shellhart, who's married to William Shellhart, and they both had lifelong experiences. William was healed. They both had a very friendly onboard UFO encounter in Sedona, Arizona. But once as a child, in Germany, when Rose was just a very young girl, she nearly drowned and could never understand quite what happened until years later when she went under hypnosis and realized that she had in fact been saved by extraterrestrials. So what happened was she was, this is in the mid-1930s, she was about 4 or 5 years old and was playing in the woods behind her home next to the stream when she slipped and fell into the river. And as she says, I'll just quote her directly, "I was playing with some children's dishes, and all I remember was I'm drowning. I don't know which way is up or down. Then somebody pulled me out and didn't say a word. And when I looked around to see who it was, they had disappeared." It wasn't until years later that she went under hypnotic regression and saw that she had been saved by these largely human-looking ETs. They were sort of hybrid-looking, perhaps, half gray, half human, had large dark eyes, pale skin, bald, but looked very much human. And these were the ones who saved her. And throughout her life, she would have encounters which appeared to be mostly benevolent. Here's one of the strangest cases I've ever heard. A lot of these cases are strange, I know, but this one, wow. This was reported to MUFON, and the witness reported this case because it was so unusual, and she wanted to know if anyone else had ever reported anything like this. And I can't say that I have. This is a very unusual case for sure. It occurred in August of 1986. This occurred at the Waweep campgrounds at Lake Powell. This is in Page, Arizona. And yeah, August 1986. The witness, who is anonymous, was just camping there at the Waweep campgrounds and walking along the shore of Lake Powell. It's a very large lake. There are lots of very rural areas where few people are, although this lake is very popular. And it was at night. Nobody was around that she could see, and she's walking directly along the shore when suddenly this bald-headed man attacks her, just jumps out of the darkness and pins her to the throws her to the ground. She's half in and out of the lake and is on her back, and this man just crawls on top of her and is beginning to assault her. She knows what's going to happen. She's terrified and is fighting back as best as she could, but this man is stronger than her, and she's just terrified because she knows what's about to happen when suddenly this UFO appears. Two bright lights appear. One's sort of at the distance there, one's at the other end of the lake, and another's a little bit closer and swooping closer. And as it gets closer, it takes on the appearance of a big sort of swirling ball of fog, this glowing ball of foggy light. And the wind starts picking up and getting more stronger to the point where it starts picking up pebbles and small stones and starts pelting both of them with these rocks. It's like very close at this point, right over the lake there. And they're both getting hit by these rocks, and the wind is very strong. And finally, the man just jumps up, turns around, and sees this thing. His eyes get wide in terror, and he looks down at the witness and says, "We better get out of here." And he starts to run away. Well, the witness, took one look at the UFO and this other guy, and she makes her choice. And I'll just quote her directly, as she says, "I looked at him and the ball of fog and decided I would rather go with the ball of fog. So I started walking out into the water toward the ball of fog. Then it just vanished. The water and wind calmed down, and it was quiet again. I did not know what to make of this. I have not heard of many reports like this, but it seemed like it made a special trip down from the sky just to rescue me from this man." I have to agree. I think that's exactly what happened here. And this is a case in which ETs apparently intervene to rescue a person from being assaulted by another person. And while it may be largely unique, there are other cases that are in fact similar. One case I investigated personally, I wrote about in my book, Onboard UFOs. And the witness in this case is Dolly, an amazing lady. The more I get to know her, the more I'm impressed. I think she actually might be one of the most intelligent people, one of the most accomplished people I've ever met. So I'm just really impressed by her. She's had experiences, UFO experiences, her whole life. She's had sightings as a young girl, as a teenager, as an adult. One time she was driving with her girlfriend and very late, and she was extremely tired and had gotten lost and didn't even realize she was lost when a UFO appeared and actually guided her home. So that was an amazing incident. She had another amazing incident in which her health was unwell. She was suffering from a blood sugar shock. She was suffering from diabetes and was having a real problem with her blood sugar and was passing out when a gray appeared and woke her up and urged her to get to the hospital and helped her do that. So that was another amazing incident. But the most amazing, at least for me, occurred in 2008. Dolly at this time was working as a munitions driver at Fort Benning. This is in Georgia. And she was driving, I believe, home from, or no, actually, she was driving to work one evening. This is late at night. And she sees this light. And she knows instantly it's unusual because it's very large. And as she looks behind her, she can see this thing approaching. She first thought it was stadium lights, but there couldn't be a stadium there. And this because it was a very rural area. And as she sees these lights, she realizes they're approaching her car, and it's very large. She knows aircraft. She knows something this large would have to be making quite a bit of noise, and it was completely silent. So she slows down her car. When this thing comes buzzing down right over her car, does kind of a U-turn and parks there. And so she stops in the middle of the highway there and looks at this thing. And it's very large. It's got lights all over it. It's clearly unusual and very low. And she gets this telepathic message from it. And it's a very clear message. And it says, home is not a good place. Home is bad. Home is not good. And while the message was very clear, she wondered if they meant home as in Earth, the entire planet, or her home in particular. She was having some problems at home with her husband. He was acting very sort of aloof, and they weren't getting along that well. And she was also having some health problems. She was feeling quite unwell. She couldn't quite figure out what was wrong. And she was just very impressed by this sighting. It shook her up because this thing had clearly singled her out. She got to work. She made some queries and found out that there was no unusual traffic in the area that she could find out. She went home and had some Chinese food with her husband that he brought home, and got really ill after that and had to be rushed to the hospital. And they could not figure out what was wrong with her. They thought she had food poisoning. But she had a strange dream that night when she got home. And again, it was about this UFO experience, but the only thing this time, her husband's name was added to the message, that there was something wrong there. And now her ex-husband, I should say, because she started to watch him much more closely. And he was acting very strangely. And at some point, he said, her health is just taking a real strong downturn. She's going back and forth into the hospital. They can't figure out what's wrong. At some point, they think she's having a heart attack. And she nearly dies, and they just can't figure it out. And her husband is very aloof and makes an announcement. He says, I'm handling the finances. I'm going to handle all the finances from now on. And she says, no, you're moving out. That's what you're doing. And so they became separated. And at this point, she was rushed back to the hospital, and they conducted some more tests and found out that she had, in fact, not had food poisoning or a heart attack. She had antifreeze in her blood. And an investigation followed, and she found out that her ex-husband had, in fact, been poisoning her. He had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy and was feeding her antifreeze. So this caused her all kinds of health problems, but thankfully she did recover and probably would have died, she believes, if not had this UFO shown up and warned her that she was married to basically a sociopath, and she had to get out of that situation, which she did, thankfully. And this UFO saved her life. And there are a lot of cases in which UFOs have intervened, as we've seen, to save people's lives. I know another case reported to MUFON, actually investigated, couldn't find the case, unfortunately, but I remember it vividly. A lady was at her home when her refrigerator fell over on top of her, and she couldn't get it off, and she was going to die unless somebody came to help her. And that's when ETs showed up. They weren't typical grays, but it was definitely not human, and was able to lift this refrigerator off of her. And I know of many other cases. I have done a couple of other videos about people who have been rescued. One involved the case of Pat Kate, who in 1985 had an amazing experience in which thousands of people were apparently rescued from the Nevada Del Ruiz volcano. So you might want to check out that video because that goes into that case in detail. And another video I did is about the case of Stan Hughes, who also had a benevolent encounter in which ETs showed him up and warned him that there was a situation at home that needed his attention. So definitely there are cases in which ETs do intervene in a way that seems to be altruistic, benevolent, kind-hearted, and there to help people in a wide variety of ways. From, as we have seen, helping someone to get a job, find employment, improve their financial situation, all the way to avoiding a car accident or being prevented from a car accident from happening, to being, having your life actually saved from drowning or a hurricane even. And I know there are other cases out there like this. I'm sure, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these go completely unreported. I did a whole study of these kinds of cases in my book, The Healing Power of UFOs. So I know there are a lot of cases like these, and that I think they're very significant and that people should know about them because they do show a benevolent side to the ETs, which often get a bad rap. So I think people who believe that all ETs are demonic or evil should remember that there are in fact cases in which ETs do help people, and these are just some of them. So that's this presentation. Thanks once again for listening, and until next time, keep having fun.